Back here on the 3 a.m. Coney with another segment of Unearthing Cincinnati's Past with Greg Hand. Greg, thank you for being on again.
Thank you.
And last week we talked about the pandemic. This year you were talking, or this week you are talking about New Year's 1921. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. What do you have for us?
Now, in 1921, there were no television stations in Cincinnati, but I really wish that I had been the anchor for a television newscast for New Year's Day on 1921, because it would have gone something like this. Jim Dimson, age 34, earned the honor of being the first person arrested in Cincinnati on New Year's Day. Patrolman Harry Breckenridge and Peter Schottel arrested Dennison after he fired 4 rounds from his service pistol out a second-story window at his home, as the bells and whistles of the city welcomed in the new year.
You got to celebrate somehow.
Okay. But that's the tip of the iceberg. In the same newspapers, you read about Bart Marcioni, who was the manager of the American Ice Cream Company, which had its factory on 6th Street in the West End. He was closing up shop on New Year's Eve, and a bullet sailed through the front window of his shop. Corinne Stockoff, a laborer heading home from the bar, apparently, in Northside on Apple Street, was struck in the hand by a bullet that fell out of the sky.
Okay.
The patrolman James Fritz was over in the East End at midnight, and he discovered 5 men gathered around an electric street lamp in the East End, using it for target practice. So all 5 of them were firing pistols at it.
Nice.
He chased them off. One of the people fired at the officer. He fired back, struck the guy in the hip, ended up arresting him. The big one is 2 gentlemen from northern Kentucky, Ferdinand Muller from Newport, Ernest Wells from Covington, were both wounded in their attempt to hijack a truckload of bootleg whiskey on its way through Cincinnati with an armed federal guard. One of the guards ended up getting wounded in this shootout as well.
Oh, wow.
A 13-year-old boy ends up getting shot at New Year's Eve playing with a gun, and a friend of his ends up shooting him.
This is all the same night in Cincinnati.
Yeah, first thing in the morning on New Year's Day, in addition to all that other stuff, Arthur Spiegel, who is beginning his very first term as a newly appointed police court judge, has 4 shooting affrays on his docket.
So he started this.
Cincinnati, January 1, 1921. This is like the Wild West.
Yeah.
Right? And you might wonder, why is there so much gunfire?
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out, right now at midnight, you still get the odd gunshot going off, but at midnight, what do people do today?
Shoot off fireworks.
Shoot off fireworks.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. At the end of 1920, the fireworks factories had not yet recovered from World War I.
Oh.
See, during World War I, there was all this nationwide rationing. They rationed food. They rationed grain. So brewers and saloons took a hit during World War I, and they especially rationed gunpowder. They allowed gunpowder to go into bullets because there's a likelihood that the bullets could be used over in Europe. but they did not allow production of fireworks. And
No
so
fireworks. Wow.
the fireworks factories hadn't gotten back up to speed. And so at the end of 1920, going into New Year's 1921, if you wanted to make noise on New Year's Eve, you got a gun out.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. And like this guy sitting in his second floor room, pop the window open, you hear the bells, and you start firing wildly away.
Makes sense to me. I mean, if you don't have fireworks, what else are you gonna do?
So the safe methods back then, the bells and pots and pans and that
Bagging
sort of thing.
some pots and pans together, yeah. Almost as fun as shooting a gun out your window.
But not, you got to take it up a notch. You know? Get a little explosion going, and so that's what was going on in Cincinnati. And one of the other factors that may have come into play is Cincinnatians wanted to blow off steam somehow.
Yeah.
And this was the 1920 to 1921 New Year's was the first New Year's under Prohibition. Okay, so in another episode, we'll go into some detail on Prohibition, but this was really the first experience Cincinnati had. Now, there were a lot of parties. There's a lot of reports of parties going on in the city, large groups at hotels. That was a reflection of the 1918 pandemic. This is the first New Year's where there weren't restrictions on public gatherings. So the big death toll in the 1918 pandemic was between 1918 and 1919. But in the fall of 1919, there was another wave of that pandemic. And so it wasn't quite the lockdown that they had the year before. But in 1919, going into 1920, things were a little subdued. Large crowds were still kind of frowned upon. Yeah. So you've got one hand giveth and one hand taketh away. In 1920, you're allowed to gather in a big group and have fun, but you're not allowed to drink.
Oh, man. The perfect storm of things that happened.
Yeah, the year before, Prohibition hadn't kicked in, so you could drink, but you couldn't gather.
Yeah.
Now you can gather, but you can't drink. People tried to drink. They tried to figure out what the limits were. The national prohibition law very specifically did not prohibit owning alcohol. So if prohibition was in effect and you happened to have a very large wine cellar, there was no reason that you had to turn it in or pour it down the drain or whatever. You could have your wine cellar and you could drink all you want. And so a lot of people stocked up before Prohibition took effect, and many of them still had supplies down in the basement. And so what they do is, this is when hip flasks and other disguised receptacles are coming into play. They would show up at these hotel ballrooms with a hip flask and order a Coke and just pour the libation.
That's probably what I would have done too.
Right there. So the on New Year's Day, a very important announcement came out of the White House.
Okay.
It was not specifically directed at Cincinnati, but it reflected what was going on in Cincinnati at the time. And that is Warren Harding, who was the president-elect, announced that on his way to his inauguration, he was not going to ride in a horse-drawn carriage. That in 1921, when he was inaugurated, he rode in an automobile to the inauguration. That's the first president to do so. And it really indicates a change that was going on in Cincinnati. In the same newspaper that carried the news out of Washington that indicated that the new president was going to ride an automobile, a group of investors announced that they had received permission to build the first large parking garage in Cincinnati.
Oh, okay.
And they were planning a parking garage that could hold up to 1,000 cars. Now, I forget the name of it, but there is a parking garage, I believe, on 8th Street in Cincinnati that opened in the 1920s. And I believe that it is the oldest parking garage left in the city. And I don't think it was that garage. I'm not exactly sure where this proposed 1,000-car garage was supposed to be, but it's significant that they're going to build a place for 1,000 automobiles, because at the time that they made this announcement, they were just a few years from a time when there were only 1,000 automobiles in the entire city.
Yeah.
And they didn't know what to do with them, because since there were no parking garages, since there were no parking facilities, you were stuck with cars parked all over the place. The idea of parking at the curb for horse-drawn vehicles was really not done unless you were loading and unloading.
Yeah.
And so they would park automobiles on Fountain Square. You know, the Fountain Square at the time, if you remember, was like a large island in the middle of 5th Street. They would park in alleyways, and this was very disturbing because delivery people used the alleyways. Automobiles were rather a nuisance. They just didn't know where to put them.
Yeah, there wasn't a spot for them to go, so they were just everywhere.
Exactly, and they're not little.
That's also true.
It's not like bicycle racks.
Yeah.
Cincinnati had gone through a similar sort of congestion in 1896. 1896 is the year that bicycles emerged. You know, before 1896, you have these penny farthing bicycles with the huge front wheel and the little tiny back wheel.
Yeah.
And you have these things called velocipedes, where they don't even have pedals. They're just two wheels with a bar in between, and you sit on the bar and you do a Fred Flintstone, you know. But by 1896, they had the pedals, they had the chain drive, and bicycles exploded in 1896. And the city had no idea what to do with them, because everybody was riding a bicycle and trying to put it someplace, and we didn't have bicycle racks, and we didn't have places to put bicycles. And so back then, bicycles were all over the place.
I mean, that's kind of like when we first got like birds and limes in Cincinnati, and they were just all over the place.
Yeah, it just tied to lampposts and the whole thing. You know, people are very, very creative. Right.
Someone threw one in the Ohio River. There's just a bird scooter just floating down. Absurd.
So my daughter studied for a while in Amsterdam.
Nice.
In Netherlands, and everybody there rides a bike, and they have bicycle garages, and she has photos of these things with thousands of bicycles.
Wow.
But it's apparently traditional when the academic year ends for college students to throw their bikes into the canals. And so
okay.
Every once in a while they have to dredge the canals. Well, I don't recall any reports about people throwing bicycles in Cincinnati's canal, which was still operating back then, but they were a nuisance. And so in 1920, now the issue is automobiles. And Cincinnati, because of the automobiles, was integral to the development of a brand new word, or at least a new definition for an existing word, and that was jaywalker. Cincinnati was so upset about automobiles that they were so dangerous. They were so dangerous. You know, in 1920, 1921, that sort of thing, when we have relatively few automobiles still, this is a time when your garbage truck was still horse-drawn. Your moving companies were horse-drawn. So the early 1920s were not a time when everybody had an automobile, and yet the death toll in the city of Cincinnati from automobiles was larger than it is today.
Wow.
And not just marginally larger, but twice the number of people killed by automobiles.
Wow.
And
yeah, just something new on the road they're not ready to pay attention to and watch out for.
Exactly. If you look at some of the old books that have pictures of Cincinnati, the 1880s, 1870s, that sort of thing, they will show a street scene, and one of the things that strikes you is everybody was in the street. Pedestrians were in the street, horse-drawn carts were in the street, people on horses were in the street, people on bicycles were in the street. Everybody was in the street. And of course, none of these modes of transportation were really moving fast enough to do any significant damage. You had plenty, they were noisy, you had plenty of indication they were coming, you knew to get out of the way. The people who got injured tended to be injured by streetcars. And even though the streetcars were horse-drawn or electric, they were not very fast. They were under 20 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And the people who got injured were the people trying to jump on them. You know, it wasn't like the streetcar veered off the tracks and hit somebody.
Right.
It was people trying to get on them who were injured. But with automobiles, they were so fast. 30 miles an hour was unheard of at the time, and so heavy, and people were not used to driving them, that upwards of 200 people a year were getting killed. And so the automobile manufacturers took the logical approach for them, and that was to blame the victim.
Okay.
Instead
they shouldn't have been standing there.
Instead of saying, we're going to find a way to make our automobiles safer, they told the pedestrians who got killed, it's your own damn fault. And this came to a head in Cincinnati when city council was suggesting that a law go into place putting a governor on the motors of any motor car in Cincinnati, so that within city limits, automobiles would not be able to exceed 25 miles an hour. And the automobile manufacturers would have none of that.
Yeah, don't want to make them slower.
And so through organizations like the AAA, they started pushing the message that if you get injured by an automobile, it's because you did something wrong. And so you're not allowed to be in the street anymore. You can only be in the street at crosswalks. And if you don't cross in the crosswalk, you're a jaywalker. and jaywalking now becomes a crime.
Wow. They
So,
literally took over the streets and said, now automobiles own these.
That's right. You know, there was a magazine advertisement when I was younger of a Chevrolet Suburban, you know, those huge vehicles, right?
Yeah.
And it's doing a little drifting out in the desert, and this big cloud of dust is going up behind it. And the tagline for the vehicle was, "As a matter of fact, I do own the road."
There you go.
And that's what the automobile manufacturers said to Cincinnati. You know, uh, look at who owns cars. It's the rich people here who own the cars, and you're inhibiting their ability to drive around and get to the office and get home. And this is bad for business. And you've got to turn over the streets to automobiles. And we want laws in place to penalize people who are putting themselves at risk by not
getting in the way of me trying to drive fast.
You got that exactly.
Wow. That's incredible.
Now, the interesting thing is, on January 1st, 1921, 100 years ago, that was still in the future. You know, signs were there that there were going to be a lot more automobiles, but that prohibition was still in the future.
Yeah.
The big political debate was with the reformers who had gotten prohibition into place, because this was the year that the Grand Alliance fell apart. So to get prohibition into place, the reformers needed women, and as a payoff for the support women provided, women got the right to vote. They needed the religious establishment, particularly the Protestant churches. The Catholics were kind of suspect because they used wine, and a lot of the Germans were Catholic and they drank beer, so the Catholics were kind of suspicious. But for the Protestants, that was the alliance. And then law enforcement, because the saloons were really the locus of a lot of crime in the city. So you needed all of them to come together to get prohibition passed. Once it got passed, the idea of what's the next step just broke that coalition apart. So on January 1, 1921, you can find newspaper articles where people are saying, for instance, am I going to have to go to Canada to catch a smoke next year? Right?
Don't take the rest of my freedoms.
Yeah. Now that they've taken away my booze, when are they going to take away my cigarettes or my cigars? I guess most men smoked cigars back then.
Yeah.
You know, when are they going to shut down the theaters? You know, and the real political debate going on was the prospect of a national Sunday law, the blue laws. Before Prohibition, lots of individual cities had blue laws where they said theaters can't operate on Sunday, sporting events can't occur on Sunday, that sort of thing. And in fact, it's one of the reasons that the Cincinnati Reds got into trouble with organized baseball, is because they wanted to have these Sunday games, right?
Yeah.
But in January of 1921, a lot of people thought this is the next step. The people who got prohibition in place are going to push for a national Sunday law, and so there were a lot of heated arguments about it. Interestingly, because even back in 1921, they were still known as the Gray Lady of Vine Street. The Cincinnati Enquirer was opposed to this.
Oh.
The Cincinnati Enquirer basically said, you know, you got prohibition, enough is enough, and they wrote an editorial criticizing what they called a frenetic minority of alleged purists.
There you go. There's a good phrase for you.
A frenetic minority of alleged purists. And I thought that was a real zinger.
Yeah, that's great.
So speaking of sports, the big sport, the very popular brand new sport in Cincinnati in 1921 was competitive walking.
Competitive walking.
Cincinnati had not yet gotten into the long distance running thing. That was some years in the future, and it would be,
I mean, you got to walk before you can run.
Yeah, it would be decades before the Big Pig marathon came around,
Flying
right?
Pig, yeah.
Flying Pig Marathon. And so competitive walking, and in fact, there was a guy named Sebastian Linehan, who was the champion walker in the United States and president of the American Walkers Association. And he lived here in Cincinnati, and he distributed advertisements on New Year's Day indicating that that some major walking events were coming up in Cincinnati for what the newspapers called a notable year in Cincinnati for the heel and toe game.
There you go. Nice.
So probably walking just fast enough to avoid those automobiles.
Yeah, and at what point, what was the competitive walking? Were there rules on what would constitute a jog, where they had to make sure they were heel to toe, or?
That's exactly it, and that's why they refer to it as the heel and toe game. Your heel and then your toe had to hit.
That's a quick,
right? And so, just like in the Olympics, you get that little wiggle going.
Yeah.
Right?
find your cadence. There you go.
And that was the big thing. And apparently, crowds turned out for that. The events were held at Crosley Field, which it was not yet called Crosley Field, but they would fill big venues like that with the heel and toe game.
Wow, a lot going on around New Year's 1921 in Cincinnati. Wow, there you go. Yeah, so with the perfect storm of everything, post-pandemic, regulations, prohibition, everything that was happening with New Year's of 1921, you were just trying to survive in Cincinnati while sober, while no fireworks, while trying to avoid cars, while
you're trying to avoid prohibition bootlegger shootouts.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many different things that were going on that you could be afraid of, had to survive at New Year's. I can understand a guy that's just drinking alone with his private stash in his apartment and then just starts firing a gun out a window, because what else can you do? You can't you can't do anything else.
And by the way, you've touched on something that really comes into play here.
Yeah.
And that is when we were talking about who had automobiles and who did not, the police did not. Okay, so we were not yet at a state where criminals were using automobiles. They were relatively expensive, but the police had not yet adopted them. So if there had been a criminal trying to make an escape in an automobile, even if it was only going like 35 miles an hour or something.
Yeah.
In Cincinnati, what you had to chase them was mounted police.
That would be a very interesting Fast and Furious. Like if they get to like Fast and Furious 20 and they run out of ideas and it's like blast to the past and they go back and like they all have cars and the police don't.
The police just have horses, right?
That's crazy. Yeah, you said that the like garbage, everyone else was still horse-drawn carriage.
Still horse-drawn.
Moving companies. Wow. Wow. At what point did how many more years did it take for that to become the more government, more, just normal people doing like the moving company and garbage stuff like that to actually have automobiles?
It was probably the next decade.
Okay.
I have talked to people who lived through the Depression.
Yeah.
And there were still a number of horse-drawn vehicles then. So in the 1930s, but they were getting rarer and rarer. The people they talk about using horse-drawn vehicles in the 30s would have been like the rag and bone men.
Yeah.
So people who would have gone along. The rag and bone men were like the recycling department. They would have gotten used cloth that could be turned into paper, and bones that could be rendered into fertilizer, and they would pick them up from the houses and then take them different places. And they talk about them still being horse-drawn. Also, scissors grinders. You would keep your scissors and your knives around, and somebody would come down the street with a sharpening implement on the back of their wagon, and you'd hear them coming and bring everything out, and they'd sharpen
to get them sharpened. Nice.
Yeah. And so those kinds of things were going on in the 30s, but by then the cops were in automobiles, the crooks were in automobiles. Cincinnati was a huge truck manufacturer.
Yeah.
And so Cincinnati would have been an early adopter for things like the moving companies and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting to think about, that everything was a horse-drawn carriage. The automobile comes into play. So as we own the roads.
We own the road.
And then within a decade, they basically do. They have taken over all of the transportation that would have been horse-drawn carriages. You got it. There it is. All right. Well, hopefully Cincinnati survives New Year's 2021 a little bit. I mean, we still have a lot of things that have happened this year. Little less gunfire. Less gunfire. We still have fireworks. So, I mean, save your neighbors. Don't shoot guns out your window. Stick with the fireworks. A lot going on in 2020. Hopefully it's not going to be as wild of a New Year's. I mean, we still have some regulations, but people are going to be drinking and celebrating. So, I mean, maybe we can do some correlations and see if history is repeating itself here again too. All right, that'll do it. That'll do it for us here on the 3 a.m. Coney with another episode of Unearthing Cincinnati's Past with Greg Hand. Thank you again for coming on. You can follow Greg at his blog, Cincinnati Curiosities, and we will have you on again next week. Look forward to the next time. Thank you.